Okay, let's restart. So I have gone through the globalization debate. We have looked at three different schools or three different arguments on globalization. The globalists, the skeptics, the skeptics, and the transformationalists. I would like to first ask you if you need clarification on each of these arguments. Is there any, I don't want your opinion right now, but I want to know if you have any questions about each of these arguments, because the arguments cut across traditional political lines. So if you look at the globalist argument is quite similar to the neoliberal argument, but many classical Marxists would also agree with the globalist argument. The skeptics contain traditionalists, people like Samuel Huntington, Donald Trump, we can say, the UK Independence Party, but also many skeptics are anti-imperialists, are people who've been part of anti-imperial struggles or anti-globalization struggles. People like Ananda Shiva within India. Naxalites, we can talk in terms of the Syriza within Greece, Podemos within Spain. And transformationalists would be the argument which is taken by many theorists of globalization, and we can also say by some liberal institutionalists and those advocates of a greater role for regional organizations, such as the European Union and perhaps the transformation of SAARC and ASEAN, etc. So any questions on any of these three schools of thought? First, let's take globalists. Any questions? Okay, seeing none. Skeptics. Any questions on the skeptical argument? Finally, transformationalists. Any questions on the transformationalist argument? Yep.
It says that the supporters of the school says state is still important, but it cannot provide governance and security as its own. Then what are the other roles they perceive for the state? What is the role of the state if it cannot provide governance and security? What are the other roles a state possibly play in a globalized world? What is their assumptions on that?
Excellent question. In terms of the transformationalist school of thought, it's a school of thought within this particular debate. The argument is that the state is still important, but the role of the state is changing. However, this is not to say that the state is not responsible for our security, but the role which the state plays in providing our security changes. So in other words, there is a change in the role of the state from, we look at the national security paradigm, the provision of security through military force, through defense. We can also talk in terms of a change in the role of the state economically in providing security or welfare benefits. So I can give you an example of the second argument. So particularly a skeptical argument would be to say that the state in this new global era has not provided the same welfare benefits which they have before. They have tightened up the loopholes involved and tightened up the regulations, which mean that many people who were previously entitled to welfare are no longer entitled to this. Now, the transformationalists would say that the state still has a role to play. If we look at the globalist argument, the state should do nothing. It's up to the market. Transformationalists will point to states such as Singapore, China to a certain extent. You could argue even Britain, as well as India, and see that those states have played a key role in trying to attract and manage foreign direct investment. So let's look at China, for example. If we look at China, we find that there are certain new economic zones. So starting with the Deng Xiaoping government in the 1980s, the policy was to try and make special economic zones bordering Hong Kong, Guangzhou, in Guangzhou province, so including Guangdong, including Shenzhen. Now, I recently, just before coming to India, visited Guangdong for the first time from Hong Kong. And what I didn't realize was that the special economic zones are actually wealthier than Hong Kong. So I asked the Chinese people, where can I do shopping? And they said, Hong Kong. We go to Hong Kong to do shopping because it's cheaper. So this is an example of how the state actively played a role in trying to create special economic zones. These special economic zones were not extended to the rest of China. If they were extended to the rest of China, then China would have had no problems joining the World Trade Organization. But a lot of the problems in the 1990s and the 2000s about China's participation in the World Trade Organization was that they were unwilling to open up their agricultural sector to the same market reforms. So in this sense, the state has played a role, but it's played a different role. Remember, we're talking about China. China is a communist society. So before Deng Xiaoping, the state provided everything. It provided you with a job. It provided you with health care. It provided you with education, not during the Cultural Revolution, but in other times. It provided you with food. But the nature of the state's role has changed since the opening up of China to global capitalism. The state is still there, but it's not providing people in Shenzhen with the same welfare benefits, but it's giving tax incentives for foreign direct investment. It's playing an active role in attracting capital. This is what the East Asian tigers did beforehand. So South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore is the original tiger, yeah. So Singapore basically had nothing, but managed to attract foreign direct investment by basically saying, well, if you invest here, you don't have to pay any taxes. So this is a role in which the state can play. Now, when we come to the hard sector of transformations, if we look at counter-surveillance, security surveillance, counter-terrorist activities, this is all part of the state, but the state's role in this sense has changed. It's no longer tied to hard military power. Indeed, the administration of George W. Bush, just before 9/11, was about to embark on a radical overhaul of the military sector because a lot of the technology was out of date. The involvement of internet, cyber terrorism, for example. Cyber terrorism needs to be combated. So this involves the role of the state, financial security as well. So in this sense, the state still has to provide security, but as we'll see later in the lecture, the ways in which it does so has changed because they're different security threats. That's the main argument. But the state is still responsible for security, but it can't do so alone. Any other questions or clarifications? I mean, the main point I want to get across is that these three schools are different schools of thought. So globalists and transformationists can be seen as similar, but there are differences. Transformationists, we don't know the way in which the world is going.
In a way, it's a different way of saying state is more important in managing globalization. If you want a successful globalization happening in West Asia, you need to have a strong state because the success and failure of globalization, particularly by the neoliberal economic, the Bretton Woods stuff, it's all based on the capabilities of the state which decides who succeeded and who failed. It's not exactly the concept itself.
Yeah, but the key issue here is not about state strength in this sense. It's about the state role. So the role of the state can be strong, but the role of the state has changed. This is different from the skeptical argument. The skeptical argument would say the state still does the same things as it does before, but the state chooses, in the case of the administration of George W. Bush, to fight two wars at the same time, and at the same time not provide welfare benefits or Medicare for the vast majority of its citizens. For skeptics, this is a choice. The state is making a choice on what to do. For the transformationists, the state cannot do this. The state cannot go back. Because if it goes back, then you end up like North Korea. There's no foreign direct investment. There's no possibility of any development goal or dealing with security threats. So it's not just about state strength. It's about the role of the state. And I think that's the important difference between transformationists. Now, you're right in the sense that there's still a role for the state to play. So the state has to play a role. This is very different from the globalist argument. The globalist argument would say the state is becoming less important. Transformationists would say you need states. But when we talk of strong states, a strong state is not in the national security sense, a strong sense in terms of a military powerful state. Military powerful states cannot provide security on their own. Military powerful states are important, but at the same time, there's a changing nature of state power. Okay. So are you clear on all of these? Because we're going to return to these schools of thought in the discussion. What I would like to do is basically look at the implications of globalization for security. Now, by looking at the implications for security, I am going to not look at globalization holistically, but try and look at the implications of globalizations from each of these perspectives. But I'm going to privilege the transformationalist view. So, the transformationalist perspective allows us to look at the impact of globalization for security in a more sophisticated way than the skeptical argument or the globalist argument. So for the globalists, security is still important, but it may be less important than before. For skeptics, security is still very important, and the state is there to provide us with security. But for transformationalists, there are a myriad of different security threats, which are seen as non-traditional security threats, which the state needs to combat. So the argument is that the state is transforming the role of the state, the globalization is transforming the role of the state in the global political economy. So just as I explained beforehand, there's still a role for the state. There's still state agency. But even a communist state like China cannot provide its citizens with jobs, with welfare benefits, with food, and even within the United States with free medical benefits or Medicare. It needs to attract foreign direct investment. By attracting foreign direct investment, then you can provide jobs for people. If you provide jobs for people, then the trickle-down effects, this is the neoliberal model, the trickle-down effects will benefit everybody. But these are only in some sectors of the economy. In other sectors of the economy, particularly agriculture, once you move towards agribusiness, powerful multinational corporations like Monsanto, managing most of the agricultural resources of a powerful state like the United States, you find the disappearance of farmers. So in the United States, you have cheap food which can be manufactured, which could be dumped on other parts of the world. Within India, you have 80% of the population, or even more, who are rural, who are living in rural or semi-rural areas, who rely upon the agricultural sector. You cannot move to a system which privileges food as a commodity. You can't have 800 million landless people. If you have 800 million landless people, then you have mass famine on your hand. Even though if you did have 800 million people, the economy would still be seen to be doing very well, even if you have 800 landless farmers. So the point to make is that the state has to make these decisions, which sectors of the economy to open up. But that doesn't mean that the state needs to be strong. It can be streamlined. Decision-making, governance is important. Decisions are important. You have a limited amount of resources, where do you put your resources? And where you put your resource depends on what constitutes a security threat. That's where security is important. So we have a proliferation of what may be seen as non-traditional security threats. So firstly, easy question, what is a traditional security threat?
Military threat, you have
From who?
from other countries.
Yeah, very good. External threats. Threats come from outside. I think it's worthwhile pointing out. I hope it's not too controversial because these lectures are being taped and they go to the government of India. But when we look at the idea of national security says that there are external threats. But external threats can come from within itself, within the state itself. So let's look at Latin America, for example. If we look at Latin America, the national security paradigm allowed the generals who were in charge of the Southern Cone states, Chile after the overthrow of Pinochet, Argentina, also Uruguay and Brazil, at least until 1982, to basically wage a war against communists, against students. Now, these communists, these students were all born within those states. They didn't come from outside. But because they were affiliated with various communist parties, and because communism was affiliated with the Soviet Union, they were perceived as an external threat. This is the same in the US and the UK today when we look at global terrorism. Very interesting, after the terrorist attacks of July 7, 2005 in Britain, when 4 British citizens were accused of carrying out these attacks, the British government turned around and blamed Pakistan. And they said they're of Pakistani origin, they went to Pakistan and they got radicalized. They went to Afghanistan afterwards and got radicalized in these camps. And the Pakistani government basically answered, no, they're your problem. They were British citizens. They were not Pakistani citizens. You would let them in for a start because of your border controls. These are British citizens. They became radicalized in your country. So you cannot say that they're an external threat. They're an internal threat. It's your problem. It's not our problem. But you see the same logic. The logic is, under the national security paradigm, any sort of threat, even a conventional terrorist threat, needs to come from outside. So we see it in secessionist movements. If we look at secessionist movements within South Asia or elsewhere, the argument is they're always backed by somebody else. So we look at the Maoist Civil War, the Nepali Civil War. The argument was made that India was supporting the Maoists. May have been true, may not have been true, I don't know. But this was a perception that they cannot possibly win without the support of India or China or some sort of superpower. If we look at Sri Lanka, the same argument in terms of the LTTE. The argument which many of the Sri Lankans made, Sinhalese, would be to say the LTTE was backed by Tamil Nadu, backed by the diaspora community, and backed also by India. Again, national security paradigm. Even though it's seen as an internal threat, it's an external threat. There needs to be an external linkage. If we take globalization seriously, then we cannot say that there is an outside, because our notions of inside and outside are changing. It's no longer internal or external. So terrorist attacks can be carried out by British citizens. They don't need to be carried out by people from Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan or whatever. They can be British citizens. If we look at internal threats to security, these could come from people who are disaffected by central government policies.
So what Turkish demands are having green zones that they have sharing with the other countries, with the Kurdish dominated.
I think this fits in very well in the transformationist perspective. But I think the key difference is we're looking at a conflict situation. Because if we look at Turkey, it's within a Middle East area which has a lot of internal and external threats. So this would really be, to bring everything up to date, we need to then look at how we have the erosion of a traditional security architecture. So I think it's a very important example, but it's difficult to link this directly with globalization. It's much easier to link this with secession, with war. When we talk about globalization, what I want to move towards are the threats which come from living in an integrated global economy where our understandings of inside and outside are constantly changing. A great case study could even be Delhi, where we look at, the global north, very expensive hotels, expensive parts of town, and slums next door. Probably not as bad as, Mumbai is a classic example. This idea means even if we look at crime, which is not seen as a traditional security threat, but crime is a security threat. It's not traditionally seen as coming here from outside. It can be done by somebody down your street, particularly if there's vast inequalities of wealth. I would like to go through a whole range of non-traditional security threats. The argument is that the national security paradigm views these as non-traditional security threats because it is unable to engage with them using their traditional conceptual lens. Basically, these security threats challenge the realist assumptions upon which the national security paradigm is based. We'll look at them later, but the argument here is that security threats can no longer be contained within the territorial borders of the nation state. They don't come from outside, they can also come from inside, but even to deal with inside, we need cooperation from outside. So if we look at the example of the earthquake in Nepal a couple of years ago, this was a natural disaster, so we can't talk in terms of a security threat. But at the same time, once we take a human security perspective or environmental security perspective, it basically was in a position where it put people in a position where they were insecure, unable to go about the everyday practices of their life. So what happened? The Nepali state said, yes, this is our responsibility, but we can't do this alone. We need help from outside. So the idea of outside and inside. And remember, this was a Nepali state which had just emerged from a civil war. So for a Nepali state to do this, having emerged from the civil war, this shows the changing boundaries of inside and outside. Beforehand, they did not want interference. Now they're saying, look, we need help. Help can come from NGOs, international governmental organizations, local NGOs. So it's this idea of security threats being contained inside, which are important. Okay, now let's look at the non-traditional security threats. I've just isolated some of them. But the point to make is that we're still working within a national security paradigm. So pretend you're all working in the Ministry of Defense, and these events happen. How do they impact you? What policies, recommendations can you make? So one of the earliest would be the financial crisis. So if we look at the 2008 financial crisis, this financial crisis basically constituted, if you take a human security perspective, one of the most important global systemic crises to hit the global integrated economy, global capitalism, for over 20 or 25 years. Now, although this originated within the United States, particularly in the housing markets, its impact and effect spread across the world and arguably was contained in the United States by a massive influx of funding, of spending by the government. So the financial crisis spread across different borders. It hit the European Union very hard, and particularly the indebted nations of Greece, the PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, who saw their external debt increased as a result of changes within the interest rates and the availability of capital in the United States. So financial crisis can be seen as a non-traditional security threat. In 1929, when you had the great stock market crash, it was not seen as a security threat. But look what happened afterwards. So within the decade following the great stock market crash, what happened globally? So the question is, after the great stock market crash of 1929, when financial crisis was not seen as a security threat, what happened globally? What was a feature politically as a result of the financial crisis? Sorry? Yeah, you could say the rise of fascism, but beforehand you had an economic depression. So a financial crisis leading to economic depression, leading to revolution, leading to the rise of fascism. And what did this culminate in 1939, 10 years afterwards? World War II. So in this sense, even for those realists who would dismiss the financial crisis as a security threat, it has conventional security implications. This is the point to make. This is, I think, very important in E.H. Carr's classic book, The 20 Years Crisis, when he looks at the origins for the Second World War. He locates it very much within the Treaty of Versailles. He has one chapter on political economy, which I think is an excellent chapter. But another reading of the 20 Years Crisis would be to say it's not a 20-year crisis, it's a 10-year crisis. The 10-year crisis was the Wall Street crash of 1929. Conventional economic models to contain the economic depression failed. The only way was war, because war stimulated spending. So you had the Soviet model and you had the fascist model. And then afterwards, with the Second World War, you had the emergence of Keynesianism and a militarist Keynesianism, which was increased public spending in the economy. So here, financial crisis equals a security threat. Linked to financial crisis is migration. Now, when we look at financial crises, how did financial crises happen, particularly in a globalized world? What normally happens? What makes a crisis a crisis? Movement of capital is a central feature of a globalized market. So what makes it a crisis? Yeah, sorry? Lack of jobs, very good. Well, that's a Malthusian argument. I hope I never hear that again. But that is a valid argument, unfortunately. But let's look at, lack of jobs. Now what happens? Financial crisis leads to people losing their jobs. Why do they lose their jobs? Just because there's a financial crisis.
There's no cash.
Why is there no cash? Where does the cash go?
The money was
Huh? Sorry? Exactly, yeah. If we look at the lack of investment, then lack of demand, and this goes back to lack of investment. But let us look what happens in a financial crisis, because we had other financial crises beforehand, but we didn't have a global financial crisis. Remember the East Asia financial crisis of 1998. Then we had the newly emerging market economies financial crisis of 1999 to 2000. Why were they regional crises? So 1 million people lost their jobs in Indonesia. More than that. I think 10 million people were plunged into the poverty line in Indonesia as a result of the 1998 East Asian financial crisis. South Korea, technically the most developed society in terms of information technology in the world today, had a massive economic restructuring in 1998, which was a result of a crisis. But what made it a crisis? Lack of jobs, correct. But why do people lose their jobs? What happens to this capital?
Because of globalization, now there's a global impact. Because the MNCs are manufacturing what they are producing in the United States, they are exporting it. Now it is happening that even if there is a problem in India, the demand stops here, then it will impact the economy in USA. So 2023, the crisis happens not even in one country, but internationally.
Excellent, very good understanding of this. But my point here is about what options there are for capital. So what makes a crisis a crisis?
The foreign capital can be withdrawn when crisis
Exactly.
hits, and the profit can be expanded.
Exactly, yeah.
There is a cash crunch in the
So that's why a lack of employment results from financial crises, because the money goes elsewhere. The East Asian financial crisis was an East Asian financial crisis because the money went out of East Asia. It went to the newly emerging markets of the former Soviet Union. But then guess what happened? Contagion effect. Contagion effect meant the money then left there and went back to East Asia. In both cases, hundreds of millions of people lost their jobs, or at least millions of people lost their jobs. Now, capital is mobile. Capital can go across different state borders. Well, not here in India after demonetization. But still, the idea is it's easy to shift your money across different societies. What about people? Now, you've lost your job, let's say in India, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. What do? Where can you go?
The state.
Huh?
Again, state.
Other states. So it's this idea of illegal migration or migration. It's illegal only because the state says it's illegal. But this is where states are important. States cannot prevent the flow of money elsewhere. I was a student at the London School of Economics when you had it was Black Friday, which is an economic crisis triggered by a former alumni of LSE who bet money against the pound. He bet against the pound during whether the pound would join the European exchange rate mechanism. And something like £1 billion were wiped off the value of the British pound within a single night. Now this shows that at the high levels of capital in a globalized economy, you can withdraw money. By withdrawing investment from Britain, this meant the value of the pound plummeted. By putting money back in, the value of the pound went back. Same with rupees, same with every other country, every other currency. But you can't do this with people. If you do this with people, we look at states. So what do you need in order to work in another country? Many of you may have done so or are doing so. Many of you may do so in the future. What would you need? So you find an excellent job advertised in the United States or Japan or Korea, and you want to go. What do you need in order before you can get the job? Visa. And who gives you a visa? Now, this is like a double whammy. Who gives you a visa? Government of who? Firstly, the government in which you are going. Now, what do you need in order to get a visa? You need a passport. So who gives you the passport? So your own state. So you need a passport from your own state. And in many states in this world, including some people even within India, may not be able to get passports. It's the decision of the state whether to give a passport to somebody or not. And then the decision of the receiving state whether to accept you. And you have to pay money, or your company has to pay money for the state, for your visa. Now, if we look at it logically, the state is not providing you with a job. You have found a job overseas. You have found a job in the United States or in Japan or Canada or Korea. The company which is employing you will be paying for you. You have not been invited by the government of the United States, by Japan, or by Canada. You've been invited by that particular company which wants you. They have not invited the state of India into their society. Yet the whole idea of migration involves what we'll call securitization. Basically, you are subjected to different levels of bureaucracy and different levels of security checking, securitization. So you have to prove that you're not involved in illegal activities. It's quite strange. If you're going to apply to study or for permanent residence within the United Kingdom, you have to sign this absolutely ridiculous form which says, have you ever been a member of an organization which has been actively involved in terrorism? You have to sort of tick the box. And I was just wondering, does anyone tick the box, even if you are actively involved? But this shows that even if you want to work in a different country, you're subjected to different layers of security, different layers of securitization. So right now in Europe, one of the most pernicious and most contested debates arguably the most important debate in Europe, particularly in national elections. If we look at the referendums for Britain to join or to leave the European Union, was migration, and was the idea of the difference between good migrants and bad migrants. So good migrants are refugees. They come from Syria. They're usually children, usually babies, women, children, babies, from a war-torn place. Bad migrants are usually men. They are from Africa, or they're from Afghanistan, they're from Pakistan. And they come here to seek a job. So it's a different idea of good migrants and bad migrants. Now, what people are missing in all this is that the migrants who are actually coming in will not be taking away jobs, but will be doing different types of jobs and maybe bringing in different forms of investment. It costs a lot of money to migrate. Imagine not having to spend, $2,000 or $3,000 in order to smuggle yourself into a country. Then you have $2,000 or $3,000 to spend to stimulate the economy within that country. So what I'm trying to get at is the difference between the mobility of capital and the immobility of labor. So capital is mobile in a global economy. Labor is not. It's still subject to the power of the state. It's still the state which decides who is illegal and who is illegal. Allied to this is human trafficking. Now, human trafficking, I think we need to make this very clear. Usually when you mention human trafficking, there's an association with gender and sex work. But there is a difference between the two. Human trafficking can be people who are trafficked to work in construction plants in different parts of the world. The trafficking of people from Myanmar into Bangkok to work on building sites. This is a phenomenon of illegal migration, but trafficking also can be more pernicious because it's in the hands of criminal or criminalized networks. Usually with illegal migration, there's an element of choice. Illegal migration will be a migrant wants to leave their state because they don't have a job, or they may just want to leave anyway. They want to go to another state. But with human trafficking, the person may not have a choice. There may not be any agency involved. So when we look at the trafficking of Nepali girls into Mumbai, into brothels in Mumbai, I think there was an estimate that it was between 30 and 50% of all of those trafficked were between the ages of 10 and 20. So, and many of them, I think almost 50% of that 30% came from Nepal. Many of them were kidnapped. So in this sense, the human trafficking has this pernicious effect. So it can be seen as a security threat. The state needs to do something about it. But in many states throughout the world, states are complicit in it. I mean, if we look at the border between India and Nepal, it's a huge border. The border between America and Mexico, again, for illegal migration, it's a huge border. That's why Trump wants to build a wall. But how do you do? What do you do about this? Well, you need to penetrate these criminal networks. How do you penetrate these criminal networks? Again, it's a non-traditional security threats. So you have police forces, armed police forces, trying to lead raids on, brothels or places where people are being trafficked. But everybody can see them coming. They wear uniforms. They have weapons. So in this sense, you need a different type of security apparatus to combat it. You may have to work with organizations who try to combat trafficking. In order to do so, you need to infiltrate them. And also, this is the nasty side effect of human trafficking, is that particularly in societies such as Thailand, arguably India, I don't know, would be the complicity of state workers in these trafficking networks. So if you look at the trafficking of women from Cambodia into Thailand, or Laos into Thailand, well, research has shown that a lot of these workers are trafficked and with the full complicity of local police forces. They know about them. So in this sense, the state itself, which is meant to protect them, which is meant to protect us, is allowing this to happen. So there needs to be greater surveillance by the state of different agencies of the state. This is a non-traditional security threat. And of course, this links up with global terrorism and criminal networks. I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is a course in itself, and many of you would know far more about it than I will. But the way in which, when we look at global terrorism and criminal networks, how this is seen to be posed as the great non-traditional security threat. So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we find that the United States wakes up on the morning of September the 12th, 2011, and realizes that it has been subjected to a terrorist attack. The people inside the State Department, inside the Pentagon, where one of the hijacked planes crashed, have a dilemma. Their key dilemma is, who do we blame? Notice the national security paradigm. Where do threats come from? External. They come from external threats. And what's external? External what? External state. Excellent. Now the problem is they wake up and they say, oh my God, it's Al-Qaeda. What does Al-Qaeda mean? Huh?
Non-state actor.
Yeah, but what does it mean in terms of there's a term, isn't it? Translation from Arabic? Huh?
Transnational terrorist network.
Yeah, but it's like network. Now, one of the greatest books on globalization by Manuel Castells was called The Network Society. So the United States, a state, the most powerful state in the world, is confronted by an attack by a network. It's a different security architecture is needed. What does the United States do? Huh? But who do they attack? Which state did they attack? Now, did the Taliban launch the attacks? Were they behind the 9/11 attacks? I think this is quite uncontroversial. Did they do it?
No, but they provided the logistical support by letting their state hijack.
They let the networks in. So they met Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and those who came up with the original 9/11 terrorist attack. Most of the original attackers died in the plane crashes. Those who provided logistical support as part of the global terrorist networks were resident in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan as a state did not make the decision to attack the United States. The decision to attack came from a network, a global network. And this global network had many different branches. So let's look at Osama bin Laden. The United States was obsessed with Osama bin Laden for a decade. They tried to get him in 2001. Where was he all along? So they tried to invade Afghanistan. They couldn't find him. That was the rationale. We're going to invade Afghanistan in order to get rid of Al-Qaeda, in order to capture the people who did this. Where did they find him? Pakistan, which was their ally. So, whoops, we made a mistake. But this shows the limitations of the national security paradigm. The United States could only fight a conventional war. In order to fight a conventional war, you need to attack another sovereign state with a military. Al-Qaeda didn't have a military. The network could dissolve. So by the time the Taliban collapsed, within a couple of months, most of Al-Qaeda had left. Then who did the United States attack next? Iraq. Again, nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. They couldn't even make any sort of analogy between the two. Why did they attack Iraq? Lots of different reasons, but one of the reasons was they knew they could win. They knew they could win because it's a conventional enemy. If you have a conventional enemy with a conventional military strategy, it is possible to win. That's the national security paradigm. That's the limitations of it. When you are confronted with a globalized terrorist threat, you don't know what to do. So they invented the idea of a war against terrorism, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The global war against terrorism, what is a war? This is a really simple question. What is a war? Yep. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think Vietnam does continue to hold the United States because the United States was defeated. They still don't acknowledge that they were defeated in Vietnam. Look at the difference between Japan and Vietnam. So Japan was occupied by the United States. Within 5 years, they were completely rehabilitated and were part of the American security blanket. Vietnam defeated the United States. They were basically seen as a pariah state out of the United Nations following their 1979 liberation or invasion, depending on your perspective, in Cambodia, which got rid of the genocidal Pol Pot regime. Their reward for this was economic sanctions and to be outside of international society for 10 years whilst Pol Pot was rehabilitated. So I think this shows, this shows exactly the examples why Iraq was so important. It was very important for the United States to win again in Iraq, a conventional war.
So they had good reason for that. I was 10 years old that time, 1988, and in my birthday, 16th of March, the Saddam Hussein used chemical bombs against Kurdish people, and less than 1 minute, he killed more than 5,000 people. It was near to our border that I am living, and 250 Kurds, Iranian Kurds also has been killed. So they had good reason for attacking Iraq.
Yeah, but
And those chemical weapons were supplied by European Union and America.
yeah, but yeah, I don't want to. I want to continue and try and finish this lecture. But just one qualification on this. That was 1988. Halabja was 1998.
Yes.
The invasion we're talking about was 2005, 2003.
Saddam was fighting against Al Qaeda.
Yeah. So it wasn't. I think they would have good reason in 1988, 1989. Correct. I would agree. But they invaded 2003. So I think.
After that, he attacked Kuwait. He invaded Kuwait.
Yeah, but it was Kuwait which was important in terms of because it was conventional international law. Your example is very important for human security. So right now we're still on non-traditional security threats. But the next lecture on human security, that's when you can bring up your example. Because the Iraqi state was responsible for the security of the Kurdish citizens, and they used chemical weapons against them. So this is a powerful argument for human security. But we're not here at human security yet. I wanted to get to it at this lecture, but we'll get to it tomorrow morning. So we're just trying to finish non-traditional security threats. So the point I'm trying to make is these are globalized threats. And the national security paradigm cannot protect us from these globalized threats, because Al-Qaeda is a network which knows no border, whereas the United States has borders, has to deal within, and it broke international law in order to fight the global war on terror. I'm also looking at criminal networks, because criminal networks impact and are very important for human trafficking, illegal migration, and also terrorism. A lot of the people who were involved in the Paris attacks of 2015, last November, and also the Brussels attacks beforehand, for them, the motivation was not religion. The motivation was being parts of these criminal networks which were prevalent across youth of certain religion, orientation, and demography. But these were criminal networks. There's a link between global terrorism and criminal networks. Climate change. We've already dealt with climate change beforehand. This climate change is perhaps the greatest issue facing mankind today. And it's closely related with the development of globalization. If it wasn't for the hole in the ozone layer, states would not have acted. They would not have signed the Montreal Protocol in 1987, which made the use of CFCs, curtailed the use of CFCs worldwide. So climate change, you can be the most heavily militarized state in the world, like the United States, like the former Soviet Union. You can't fight climate change. The only way to fight climate change is through protocols like the one in Rwanda recently signed, or to reduce the levels of CFCs or CO2 emissions globally. But these are non-traditional security threats. Okay. So basically, what I'm trying to do, and I'll sort of try and sum up, is that these non-traditional security threats are part of the downside of globalization. So we're basically following a transformationalist perspective. And we're saying that globalization has benefits, but it also has downside effects. And how do we deal with these downside effects? Now, these downside effects are non-traditional security threats. Non-traditional security threats mean that we need new concepts of security in order to combat them, new security architectures. One of which could be environmental security. So environmental security is the security not just of humanity, but of the environment, of the planet. Environmental security means privileging the planet. Privileging the planet means limits to development, limits to economic growth, limits to industrialization. Delhi is the most heavily polluted city in the world. Now, it may be, arguably, Delhi is one of the cities which has had the highest increase in GDP per capita over the past 20 or 30 years. But if we look at the environmental impact from the perspective of environmental security, it would be better that Delhi was like it was 20, 30 years ago, or even 40 years ago, when there weren't cars. There were just cows on the street rather than cars. We can look at China as well, environmental security. So here the argument is that development, increased economic growth, has put our planet at risk. Now, the way it differs from human security, which is going to be the focus of the lectures tomorrow, is that environmental security places emphasis on the security of the planet, and we, human beings, are arguably the biggest security threat to the environment. So human beings become the security threat. We are the problem. It's not security for us, it's security for the environment from us. So that's a different form of security. Relates to this financial security. Financial security means capital checks. So if we look at Malaysia in the 1998 East Asian financial crisis, Malaysia's economy was not affected. Malaysia's economy was not affected because you could not move capital as easily as you could in Indonesia, in South Korea, in Thailand, in Taiwan. So they had stringent measures in check. So financial security also extends to banking system. It extends to capital controls, currency. You could argue demonetization is a form of financial security, arguably, although other critics would say it would lead to financial insecurity. We don't know. But it's an attempt at financial security. Linked with this is food security. I think in India, food security is still the biggest issue. The vast majority of people, 800 million people, live in rural areas, in the countryside. Now, until I think the first BJP government, I'm not sure, 90 of the Vajpayee government, you had 99. You had well, I mean, we'll have a bit of a lecture of this, but you had a entitlements to food. I think you still the
Food Security Act.
Food Security Act, and I think Manmohan Singh tried to reintroduce that as well. So this can be an attempt at providing food security within society. Food security can also be linked with biodiversity, protection of biodiversity, protection of farmers. Within India, one of the biggest downsides of globalization was farmer suicides, particularly in Punjab and other areas. As a result of the Green Revolution was basically a capitalist revolution. It was a global revolution which revolutionized food production, but it hit food security and it hit farmers. But food security is another different type of security, which is not prevalent within the West, but very important within countries like India, or states like India. Yeah, but I think the difference with India and Iraq after sanctions is that Iraq was targeted by those sanctions. So sanctions were not a natural effect of economic policies. So food insecurity and medical insecurity was as a result of international sanctions which were implemented by the Iraqi regime in a particular way. They could have implemented in a different way. Yeah, so in this sense, you can say that economic sanctions is actually consistent with the national security paradigm. The international community wanted to put this pain upon Iraq. They may not have wanted people to die, children to die of medical shortages. That may not have been the strategy. That was the result, mainly or partially because of the implementation of those sanctions by the regime. But at the same time, it was targeted. It was part of unconventional warfare. When we talk in terms of food security, we're really looking at the market. Because if we look at the globalization of food production, then this means you're going to have a vast reserve of landless laborers. And where do landless laborers go? They go to cities like Delhi or Mumbai or Calcutta, and they go and look for jobs. And their security is affected by this. Many of these people would not be. If you look at the number of Biharis who went to Punjab during the Green Revolution, and as soon as they lost their jobs, they had no entitlements to food because they were registered back in Bihar. So they needed to get money to go back from Punjab to Bihar in order to register, in order to get welfare benefits, in order to get rights for food. I know that's slowly changing, but food security is a different type of security. Now, now we come to the idea of global security. People like Paul Rogers at Bradford. World security is an argument made by Ken Booth, who we'll be looking at later at Aberystwyth. But the idea of global security is that we need a global security architecture, a holistic understanding of security. The state is seen as insufficient, unable to deal with the myriad of non-traditional security threats. Now, the logic of global security, I would argue, leads to a global state. So in order to have global security, you need a strengthening of the United Nations mechanism. So you need different levels of what, following Foucault, we talk in terms of governmentality, different levels of global governance to provide us with security on a global scale. Now our focus, gender security, of course. So gender security also can be seen as a different form of security. There's a gender critique of the national security paradigm and also of human security. If we look at the gender critique of the national security paradigm, it is based on the fact that the state itself is always patriarchal. The state is based and founded on patriarchy. It always tells people what to do. In my book, Religion, Identity, and Human Security, I have a chapter which looks at the banning of the hijab and the burqa in France. And in that, it's quite interesting because in the name of protecting women's rights, the French state is telling women what to do, telling women what they can wear and what they can't wear. So in this sense, it's inscribed upon their bodies, this freedom of what to wear and what to not, by the state itself. So the state, even if you have Indira Gandhi or Margaret Thatcher or Hillary Clinton as your head of state, the state itself, the structure of the state is founded on patriarchy. And this is a form of insecurity. And finally, oh no, not finally, we have health security. Health security, I would say, is an important part of human security, which will be the focus of our lecture tomorrow. So health security looks at the physical well-being of individuals. So the provision of Medicare, for example, of medical insurance. Look at the United States, where you have Obamacare. This has been, this is a gain of the previous or the current regime of President Barack Obama. But President-elect Donald Trump may get rid of this. This means that still the world's richest country has no universal medical insurance, whereas states like Cuba do, even though they're very poor. States like even Britain, with a national health service, this is a privileging of health security. And this has helped fuel the debate on migration. One of the main reasons why working class British people don't like the idea of increased migration levels to the UK is not that these people are taking away their jobs, but because they're using the National Health Service. And if they have an important transplant, this leads to longer waiting times. What they don't tell you is that most of the doctors are not European, are not British citizens, but never mind. Okay, so basically we've looked at these different types of security. We are going to be focusing on human security. Now, by way of discussion, so now we've finished the formal part of the lecture. We have two questions for discussion. The first is, which approach to globalization do you find most convincing? And how does globalization affect security? So the first question impacts upon the second question. If you're a skeptic, then your answer will be to say that globalization does not affect security. Globalization just strengthens the power of the state. For a globalist, then globalization makes the state less important. For a transformationalist, globalization transforms state power. Okay. Any questions about the question? So we have 20 minutes for discussion. First, if I could take a minute, are there any clarifications on the previous? Okay. Oh, I didn't mention ontological security, but that'll be for another day. So which approach to globalization do you find most convincing? How does globalization affect security? If you would like to contribute, I would like you first to tell me your name, your possible affiliation, and then to answer the question succinctly. We only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to let anyone speak for more than 1 minute. Who would like to start? Okay, we could do this in different ways. What I could do is read out the school of thought in globalization and see who agrees with it. So please put up your hands. This is, I'm used to teaching in Japan where people don't like putting up their hands. So the idea is everybody has to put up their hands anyway. So if you don't put up your hand, I may pick on you. So, okay, who agrees with the globalist argument? So the globalist argument? No? Okay, good. From Kerala. Please send me your tell me your name again.
global factors to influence to support our own.
Okay, thank you. Who else for globalists? Okay. Akhtar.
In fact,
Introduce yourself, Akhtar. I know who you are, but. So you have to put in the microphone. Okay, could you give her the microphone?